The Straits Budget, on the 24th of January, 1929, reported the following. Quote, the Hsin Wah had wireless on board, but did not carry an operator. 4 steamers passed the scene of the disaster within an hour of the sinking, but, owing to the pitch darkness, did not observe any signs of the wreck. A police launch, a tugboat, and several junks are searching the vicinity under very difficult conditions, as a strong gale is blowing and very heavy seas are running.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Hsin Wah's Chaos in the Darkness?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Hsin Wah was built in 1921 by the Napier and Miller shipyard in Scotland, and was immediately acquired by the China Merchants Steam Navigation Company of Shanghai. The steel-hulled screw steamer of 1,940 tons was put on a route that took it between Shanghai and Hong Kong, primarily carrying passengers. The Hsin Wah was not a ship that had led an entirely uneventful life. She was pirated in 1922 and 1928. The details of the 1922 attack are lost to time, but in 1928, 15 pirates disguised themselves as passengers and carried off the cargo and passenger belongings, as well as 4 hostages, before a Chinese gunboat appeared and chased them off. The gunboat escorted the Hsin Wah to Hong Kong, but the Chinese authorities lost the trail of the pirates after chasing them for an hour. Travel could therefore not be considered entirely safe, as the Hsin Wah departed from Swatow at noon on the 15th of January, 1929. But no one on board could imagine the abrupt end to which their voyage would come. On board, the Hsin Wah had a crew of 103 under the command of Captain M. P. Jensen, the same captain who had been in command during the 1928 pirate attack. There were also an estimated 300 passengers on board, 20 of whom had embarked in Swatow, and the remainder of whom had been on board since Shanghai. The only other information the papers had to offer about the passengers was that 30 of them had been women and children. As the ship made its way into Hong Kong in the early morning hours of the 16th of January, Second Mate Kwok was in command in company with the ship's quartermaster. By 3 in the morning, all of the other officers had retired for the night. The lighthouse keeper of Waglan Island Lighthouse, Mr. Host, would later tell his story of watching the Hsin Wah approach. What had caught his attention was that the Hsin Wah, which was approaching from the east, was not sticking to the center of the channel. Only her masthead and portside lights were showing, but from those he could see that she should pass clear of the northern end of Waglan Island, but only barely. It was 3 miles south of the course that he knew that ships generally took. Mr. Host was not alarmed by this. It still seemed as though the ship would be safe, but he still kept his eye on the ship until she had passed the northern point of Waglan. Once the ship seemed out of danger, Mr. Host got ready to signal the vessel to learn her name when the ship suddenly shifted course. Mr. Host supposed that the ship planned to pass near Cape d'Aguilar and head for the western entrance of the harbor. He was still watching when the Hsin Wah struck, bow facing Waglan Island, and in full view of the shocked lighthouse keeper. Mr. Host, who was very familiar with the navigational hazards of the area, supposed that the ship had struck a rock that he knew as Table Rock, a submerged navigational hazard that had deep water all around it, making the course seem deceptively safe. Mr. Host checked the time. It was 3:40 in the morning. The Hsin Wah had struck the rock hard, with enough force that the impact woke up the passengers and crew who had been sleeping on board. After the ship struck, she bounced off of the rock and the second mate quickly lowered the anchor to hold the ship in place and off of the rocks. But the anchor chain snapped due to the rough seas, and the Hsin Wah struck the rocks again. Now she had 2 large holes in her hull. Almost as soon as the second blow to the ship came, the ship's lights went out, plunging everyone on board into darkness. It was never known for certain, but it was assumed that rushing water had extinguished the ship's fires. It had also most likely claimed the engine crew, since the only officer who did not make his way onto the bridge after the collision was the third engineer, who had been on duty at that time. The first officer to reach the bridge and join second mate Kwok was Captain Jensen, closely followed by first mate Jacobson. By the time the first mate reached the deck, he was already fighting through a crowd of passengers who were in a state of panic, and everything was chaos. The passengers who had suddenly been awoken with a shock and were met with a ship in total darkness were impossible to control in spite of the officers' efforts. Though the night was a clear one, the waves were rough, and soon large waves were sweeping over the deck to add to the pandemonium. Lifebelts were being distributed, and some of the passengers, as soon as they had strapped one on, decided it was better to take a chance at the sea rather than the sinking ship, and dove overboard. Some of the other people on board, including First Mate Jacobson, were swept overboard when a 30-foot wave crashed over the stricken ship. The ship's bosun ran to prepare lifeboat number 3, one of 6 lifeboats that the Hsin Wah had, as well as 8 life rafts. 4 of the life rafts were completely inaccessible, but 4 remained for people to try to escape the sinking ship on. In the chaos, however, it seemed as though many people had forgotten what lifeboats they were supposed to go to. In panic, people rushed to any lifeboat they saw nearby, leading to one small lifeboat being loaded with 50 people while still hanging high in the air from the davits. When the attempt was made to swing her out, it was too heavily loaded to do so, and no one was willing to get out of the boat to enable it to be launched, so there it hung. Another lifeboat was cut down and dropped into the empty water, leading people to jump into the water to try to reach it. Many of these people were smashed against the side of the vessel by the waves, and went under. The bosun did his best to carry through his responsibility, first by checking with the officers on who had gathered on the bridge, and then going to help launch Lifeboat 3. On the bridge, he could see Captain Jensen still standing with the second mate, sending off distress signals on the ship's siren and firing rockets, trying to attract attention for help. The ship had a wireless room, but there was no wireless operator on board, so they could only hope that another ship would notice them. Some ships did pass, but it did not seem as though they were noticed because all of the ships continued on into Hong Kong. The rough seas were making everything more difficult, including the launching of Lifeboat 3. Still, the bosun and 15 members of the crew, as well as 4 passengers, all wearing lifebelts, successfully managed to get clear of the ship. The seas were too rough for them to steer or try to manage the boat, so they could only cling to it and hope for a rescue soon. Mr. Host, the Waglan lighthouse keeper, and his assistant tried to signal the Hsin Wah with the Morse lantern from the lighthouse, but they got no answer. It was a very dark night, but the light of the lighthouse repeatedly passed right over the stricken ship. Mr. Host wasted no time. The Hsin Wah had struck at 3:40, and by 3:42, Mr. Host had called the telegraph operator in the post office building and asked him to send a message to the harbor master and the authorities that there had been an accident. Mr. Host began to transmit the telegraph message that he needed to send, but after receiving many requests to repeat, and feeling as though too much time was being wasted, he requested that he be put through to the supervisor of telephones in the hope that, in this way, he would be able to get a message through to the sub-inspector of lighthouses, and that the sub-inspector would be able to get a message to the harbor office. The telegraph operator misunderstood what he was saying still, and instead of connecting him to the supervisor of telephones, the telegraph operator instead called the lighthouse keeper. This did not prove any more successful. Mr. Host still found himself being asked to repeat things constantly, and he admitted that at this point he used rather emphatic language, and finally got connected to the sub-inspector of lighthouses. Though the message had finally gone through, it had taken Mr. Host 20 minutes to deliver it. Meanwhile, he could still see the ship near where she had grounded, swaying with the waves. Having finally raised the alarm of the sinking vessel, Mr. Host realized that now the Hsin Wah was drifting, and she was now about a quarter of a mile away from Waglan Island. At 4:17, the telephone rang, and Mr. Host was told the harbor office was sending out a tug. Perhaps trying to convey the urgency of the situation, Mr. Host told the sub-inspector on the other end of the phone that the ship had now moved, and that it was sinking. Having done everything he could do, Mr. Host sent out the lighthouse crew with ropes, lights, and other life-saving devices in case any survivors from the sinking ship washed up on Waglan Island. The first survivors to be picked up were the people on Lifeboat 3, who after an hour of being tossed around by the waves were found by a junk and pulled out of the water. Just around the time that they were pulled out of the water, approximately 4:45 in the morning, the Hsin Wah turned over and sank. At first, it would be reported that only this single lifeboat had managed to escape the sinking ship, in spite of the hour that they had to prepare for the ship sinking. But it would soon be found that Lifeboat 1 had also gotten away. Not only that, but 4 of the life rafts had also been successfully launched, each with about 10 people on board. Just like the people on Lifeboat 3, the people on Lifeboat 1 and the rafts all found themselves in renewed danger from the rough sea in their small vessels. And though they passed other ships, they went unnoticed in the darkness and with the noise of the waves drowning them out. Fortunately for the survivors, once the fishing community in Hong Kong learned of what had occurred, the next morning a small fleet of fishing junks went out to try to help, along with the harbor's tugboat. It was acknowledged to have been very dangerous work. The fishing vessels were not made for seas as rough as what they were now encountering, but there seemed to be a collective agreement within the fishing community that it was worth braving the danger. They encountered many remains, but they also found some survivors, to the relief of those who had believed that only the 20 men of Lifeboat 3 had survived from the Hsin Wah. One of the people who the fishermen pulled out of the water was First Mate Jacobson. He had fortunately fastened on his life belt before going up on deck. When he was washed overboard by the waves striking the Hsin Wah, he had been carried away from the ship, and in the darkness he could not see anything more about what was happening on board. His life belt was keeping him afloat. But as he headed to shore, he thought that he was still about to meet a terrible fate of being dashed onto the rocks. Fortunately, the current caught him and carried him out to sea again. Several times he saw junks and tried to get their attention with a whistle, but each time they missed him. The waves tossing him made him feel sick, and the water was bitter cold. After a few hours he was barely conscious any longer. It was in this condition that one of the fishing vessels found him, as well as 2 of the passengers. First Mate Jacobson estimated that he had probably been in the sea for 6 or 7 hours before he was pulled on board the junk. Too weak to help himself, and one of the fishermen had dove into the water and pulled him to the ship. He was wrapped in blankets and sails and brought to the fishing village of Aberdeen. 2 more passengers were found soon after. They had been in Lifeboat 1, but when it upturned, they had been the only 2 who had held on. The 2 men had lashed themselves to the upturned boat until they had been found by some of the fishermen. Within the first day, the count of survivors went from 20 to 26. though that was still a pitifully small amount when it was considered that including the crew, around 400 people had been on board of the Hsin Wah. There was one final survivor, though, and his story was the most dramatic. Saloon cook Chan Sang-fat had been in his bunk just like almost everyone else when the ship had struck. He had joined the panicked throng on deck, but had managed to find himself a place on one of the rafts. With him, there were 11 people on the raft when it was launched, but as they passed Lifeboat 1, one of the firemen and the ship's quartermaster had abandoned the raft for the lifeboat. Since neither man was still with the lifeboat when it was picked up, they could not have been said to have made a wise choice. Things were not much better on the raft, though. As the men's hands became numb from the cold, they were unable to hold on any longer, and through the remainder of the night, 6 of the 9 men were washed overboard by the waves that washed over them. At 4 p.m., the raft drifted to shore on an uninhabited island 20 miles southwest from where the Hsin Wah had gone down. The island was mostly rock and covered with barnacles, making getting to land almost impossible. Still, the cook managed to crawl to safety, even though he was covered with cuts in the process. He was far too weak to help the other 2 men who remained crouched on the raft, too weakened to follow him. Chan Sang-fat collapsed on the island, and in the night, he heard the raft get smashed to pieces by the heavy waves. By the next morning, there was no longer a sign of the raft of his 2 companions who had been on it. The next morning, around 7 a.m., the cook was able to signal to a passing fishing junk. His rescue off the island offered its own challenges. The junk was not able to lower its small boat because of how rough the waves were, and so they brought their vessel as close to the shore as possible, leading to the bow being damaged on the rocky coast. Still, they were able to carry him on board their ship, where they gave him congee and clothing, and wrapped him in blankets. Though the junk's trip to Tai Kok Tsui, where the fishermen were from, took 13 hours, by the time they reached the area of Hong Kong, the cook said that he was still too weak to move, and so they allowed him to spend the night on board. It was not until the next morning that they thought to report to the water police that instead of 26 survivors from the Hsin Wah, there had been 27. Even 24 hours after his rescue, Chan Sang-fat needed assistance when he left the fishing junk and walked up the hill. The cook, the bosun, and the first mate would all require medical attention, and the newspapers made note of their obviously weakened states. There would be no inquiry into the loss of the Hsin Wah. Since it was a Chinese vessel, the Hong Kong authorities declared that they had no jurisdiction over it. Instead, the authorities in Hong Kong used the inquest of an unidentified victim of the wreck to try to determine what had happened on board the ship that had caused it to end so badly. With the loss of the captain, who was seen sending distress signals until the very end, as well as Second Officer Kwok, who had been the officer on watch at the time, very little of the inquest could focus on what had caused the Hsin Wah to wreck, and what had happened to lead to such a terrible evacuation of the sinking ship. Instead, the inquest primarily focused on the testimony of the lighthouse keeper of Waglan and his frustrations on how hard it had been for him to raise the alarm. The papers, meanwhile, focused on the fishermen who had risked their own lives to save others. None of the fishermen seemed to have stepped forward for recognition. Indeed, when asked about rescue efforts, they seemed to have downplayed their efforts. But the survivors made sure that everyone knew that if it had not been for the fishing fleets of the area around Hong Kong, not one of them would have ever seen land again.
For more information, please see the Straits Budget from the 24th of January, 1929, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.